All right, AP World History students, Mr. Lassiter here, and we're going to continue our review of Period 4, Global Interactions from 1450 to 1750 in this video. As a reminder, in the description down below, I have a link to the review packet for time period 4, so feel free to use this. If you need more in-depth information, AP Worldopedia, Freemanpedia are your friends. So let's take a look now at key concept 4.2. New forms of social interaction and modes of production. So in this key concept, we want to look and see kind of what was changing about the way society was organized, the way goods were produced, especially understanding the context of the global systems of trade which are developing. And let's start with kind of a bummer. That is like the eternal winter. Well, maybe not exactly an eternal winter, known as the Little Ice Age. Beginning in the 14th century, there was a decrease in the mean temperatures around the world. And it lasted until about the 19th century. And that contributed to changes in agricultural practices that we're going to see, and the contraction of settlements, especially in parts of the northern hemisphere. And again, we refer to this as the Little Ice Age, and despite what I said, it's not an eternal winter. It's, again, just characterized by shorter growing seasons and slightly lower temperatures, but over the course of a year, or of course centuries, could have pretty intense effects in terms of limiting what could be grown. And so that's going to make the introduction of, for example, American plants or American crops to Afro-Eurasia that much more important in this time period. Of course, something that we see in this time period, especially in terms of production, is that traditional peasant agriculture increased in this time period, but it also changed. We also see plantations expanding and a general demand for the increase of labor. These changes both fed and responded to the growing global demand for raw materials and finished products in this large global network of trade which had developed in time period 4 from 1450 to 1750. So let's first look at peasant labor, which intensified in many regions. For example, what you see here on the left are frontier settlements in Russian Serbia. So peasant labor is going to be used for the Russian Empire expanding into Siberia. Excuse me, I may have said Serbia there, I apologize. Expanding into Siberia to settle that region and again expand that Russian Empire. In India, we'll see an increase in cotton textile production using peasant labor. And in China, as you see there on the right, an increase in silk textile production. And of course, this makes sense as there's going to be a higher demand for silk production due to Europeans arriving and trading. Now, one thing we also see is in this time period is that slavery in Africa is going to continue. It existed in our previous time period. Even before Europeans arrived, there was slavery in Africa. Slaves were being traded across the Trans-Saharan network. So that will continue as there will be the traditional incorporation of slaves into households and the exports of slaves to the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. However, the growth of plantation economies in the Americas is going to drastically increase the demand for slaves in the Americas. Plantations that grow tobacco, but primarily plantations like the one you see pictured here, growing sugar cane, are going to lead to the growth of slavery. As the demand for these cash crops increase in this time period and in the next, so will the amount of slaves being forcibly removed from their homelands in Africa and transported to the Americas to be sold into chattel slavery. And it is true that colonial economies in the Americas depended on a wide range of coerced labor, and I'll show you some examples here. So some examples of the types of coerced labor that you would have found in the Americas include in the top right, the Spanish adaptation of the Inca Mita system. Basically, what this did was it required labor um, of the local native population to the state. And this is something that the Inca had done. It was a corvée system of labor. But the Spanish copy it for their own needs. It was used in many contexts, but we especially think of it with the mining of silver. The problem was that for the Spanish would demand a great deal of this labor, and it oftentimes was detrimental because while men were performing this required labor for the Spanish, their fields at home were not being properly prepared for the year, and so it actually led to food shortages among the native populations. One that might have been seen as even more brutal and is actually done away with is in the top left here, the encomienda system. It was modeled on a system of reconquista, or the reconquest in Iberia. The idea was that if conquistadors or soldiers conquered certain lands, they were given land grants by the throne of Spain. And then they would be responsible for the people in that land, introducing Christianity to them and Christianizing that population and reclaiming this land. But in the Americas, in practice, it was an extremely brutal system where Native Americans were forced to do very hard labor under very poor conditions, under the guise of Christianizing them and claiming this land. It's eventually done away with and replaced with a plantation system known as the hacienda system. In the bottom right there, you see also another type of coerced labor, which is relatively short-lived in this time period, or, well, goes into decline rather quickly, and that is indentured servitude. What this was contracted labor for passage to the New World. Basically, someone would sign indentures, they would get free passage to the New World, and in return, they would provide a certain amount of labor, usually somewhere around 7 years for whoever paid their passage. And at the end of their period of service, they would be given a certain amount of land. Now, this sounds like a decent deal. You get a free passage to the Americas. You're going to come out of this with some land and some opportunity. But the condition for indentured servants was often quite harsh. And so this actually led to a lot of people running away from their indentured servitude. And it will lead to a quick decline in this form of labor, as just there are not enough people willing to go do this harsh form of labor. And so Europeans turn to another forced labor system, chattel slavery. And this is what you probably think of when you think of slavery. Basically, this was the most brutal conditions you could imagine for forced labor. People being bought and sold as commodities, living in brutal conditions. And this was the main source of especially labor on plantations in the Caribbean. The main source of slaves, of course, was Africa. Slaves were turned to for a number of reasons. One, their availability, but two, because native Amerindians were susceptible to European diseases and Africans were not as susceptible to these diseases. Of course, the mortality rate on especially sugar plantations was extremely high, and so there was a constant quote-unquote need for a resupply of slaves to the Caribbean. So we see massive numbers of people being brought over, forcibly brought over, and placed into slavery in the Americas. Now, as we move on, looking at these key concepts, there are new social and political elites that develop throughout this time period. And there were also restructured ethnic, racial, and gender hierarchies that we see across the world. So both imperial conquest and widening global economic opportunities contributed to the formation of new political and economic elites. For example, the Manchu will be a new elite in China. The Creole elite of Latin America, the development of a European gentry class, urban entrepreneurs around the world. And so they will gain more and more influence in this time period. But the power of existing political and economic elites fluctuated because they faced and confronted new challenges to their ability to affect policies in an increasingly powerful, in a world where monarchs were becoming increasingly powerful. For example, the zamindars in Mughal India butted heads with the government. Nobility in Europe had to wrestle with their loss of power as we start to see European monarchs able to centralize power and gaining wealth, massive amounts of wealth from this kind of these new trade networks that had developed. So as that wealth pours in, kings are able to gain more power at the expense of the nobility. And of course, we see the same thing or similar thing in Japan with the daimyo. Some notable gender and family restructuring also occurred in this time period, and that included demographic changes in Africa as a result of the slave trade. So something we see in Africa is not necessarily a major loss in population, but an unexpected or an unnatural slow growth in population, maybe slower than what should be expected, as a great number of men are taken into slavery. But other examples of gender restructuring are seen in Southeast Asia, especially in trade, as Southeast Asian men had to rely on local women oftentimes in trade in these port cities. We also see in Europe smaller family sizes start to develop, and that's going to cause some changes in the structure of the family. We also see new ethnic and racial classifications develop in this time period, and this is one of the most significant things to understand, especially in the Americas. This comes up a lot in the AP test, and that is the development of new racial classifications in Spanish America. Now, this is kind of an old key concept, but still I think it's very important to understand that the Spanish America, we see the development of the casta system, a very intense hierarchical system with a couple dozen kind of levels of castes, basically, depending on one's race. So at the top of this chain were peninsulares. They were Spanish citizens. They were born in Spain, so they were given prominence in Spanish America. And following them was this new elite system, the Creole. These were people who were Spanish by blood but American by birth. And then we see mixtures of races, mestizos and mulattoes, which were a mixture of Spanish and native or Spanish and African blood. And of course, there were a lot more of these. And so basically the Spanish reconfigure the classification of people in their empire based solely on race. So a lot of changes taking place, a lot of changes in social organization, of course, in modes of production for Key Concept 4.2. Again, if you need more in-depth information, Freemanpedia or AP Worldopedia are really good sources for this. And we'll be back in a little bit with Key Concept 4.3.